The Frankish chronicler Gregory of Tours, circa 538 to 594, considered himself to be a Roman. He lived in a Roman world of towns, trade, and local administration. He was proud of his family's senatorial rank, and he spoke and wrote Latin. Aware of the West was now ruled by Frankish, Visigothic, and Lombard kings. He regarded some of these kings as Roman successors, ruled in accordance with Roman models. The king of the Franks ruled with the approval of Constantinople.
All these barbarian kings, of course, converted to Roman Christianity, which would reinforce their Romanitas. 200 years later, the Frankish king Charlemagne, 742 to 814, would be crowned emperor, but no longer with a direct continuity to the earlier Roman world. The intellectuals at Charlemagne's court would set out to reform political, religious, and cultural lives of their time. Their primary goal is to revive the Roman Empire, though. The separation from Rome occurred in the 7th century, mostly due to economic, religious, and cultural changes. They grew their separate ways.
By about 650, the Mediterranean world disintegrated farther. Most significant changes of economic instability in northwestern Europe internal. The cities of the West could no longer maintain their infrastructures, although Christian bishops governed from them. Barbarian kings and nobles moved to the countryside and lived from their estates. No need for an urban market. Productivity declined, as did revenues from tolls and taxes. The systems of coinage broke down. Gold coins disappear, and Europe becomes a silver-based economy.
The economy of the Roman Empire became regionalized throughout the 3rd century, but the Mediterranean was still a nexus of trade and communication. Much agricultural land with passive cultivation. There was no need to cultivate land that the state was not supervising. The state failed to supervise peasants, who became more independent and, of course, would work fewer acres. Think about it this way. If you don't have a boss breathing down your neck and you have to work all that you need to survive, are you going to work anymore just so you can have a little bit of extra surplus? I don't think so. These guys didn't either.
Leadership in Western Europe would have its limitations, chiefly due to the economy. Western Europe relied on a two-tier economy. Gold, silver, and luxury goods circulated among the very wealthy. Most people relied on barter and substitute currencies for transactions. Local lords collected rents from peasants in food or labor, but it's difficult to convert these in-kind payments into weapons, jewelry, and silks that brought prestige. Power was acquired through plunder and was fragile. A few defeats meant a loss of followers. Barbarian rulers who established kingdoms not from traditional royal families and ruled over different tribes, and Romans had no homogeneity, and unity was largely a result of a charismatic chieftain.
We have a problem. The power of lords would depend on their ability to bestow rich gifts on their followers. If not acquirable through trade, then they would have to obtain them some other way, namely through plunder and extortion. Successful chieftains tended to rule areas adjacent to wealthy but poorly defended territories that could be attacked or blackmailed, and these soft frontiers provided warlords with both land and booty to distribute.
Let's turn our attention to one of the most prosperous kingdoms, the Franks. Of all the successor states in the West, only the Franks established a single dynasty that ruled for 250 years. This dynasty reached back to Clovis, who reigned circa 481 to 511. He was a warrior king who converted to Roman Christianity. He was allied with the Gallic episcopacy and emulated Constantine.
Clovis's dynasty were the Merovingians after his legendary grandfather Merovich. Clovis's name was even more enduring as Clovis would evolve to Louis and then of course to Louis. Their success and their ability to transfer power from one generation to another is what marks the Merovingian as unique. The right of inheritance would be applied to all of the king's sons, often to male cousins, nephews, or sometimes even daughters could lay claim to property or power as rightful heirs, which does sadly mean that these transfers were often rife with civil war, which means they were often quite bloody.
The Merovingians were not the only noble family in Gaul with a claim to kingship. More successful in defending it than counterparts in Visigothic Spain, Lombard Italy, and the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic territories of Britain. In Gaul, conflicts between rival Merovingian kings did not disrupt their governance. Elements of late Roman administration survive. Latin literacy, fostered by monasteries, were linked to the Frankish court and remained important, as did the bishoprics.
This is a kingdom that starts strong with the unification under Clovis, but after its latter division into the four lesser kingdoms, Austria, Neustria, Burgundy, and Aquitaine, the king is steadily pushed into the position of a figurehead and replaced by the Mayor Domus, or Major Domo, or if you are a friend of the channel, the Major Dodo. The Merovingians practiced a form of patrimony whereby the lands of the king were treated as private property and divided amongst his followers. The king appointed magnates to be comites or counts, charging them with defense, administration, and the judgment of disputes. Effectively, they would be judge, jury, and lawyer, as well as executioner. The Merovingian law was handled by officials called Rauschenbergs who memorized the set of legal precedents which formed the basis for their society's laws. This is devoid of civil law or the innovation, really, of new laws. The Merovingian royalty would award monasteries and episcopal lands to elites who would support the dynasty, as well as extensive parcels of land would be donated as exemptions from royal taxation and to preserve them within certain families, particularly the royal family.
By 550, monasteries were thriving. By 700, more than 300 more established than in the previous century. Frankish bishops also prospered, amassing most of their landed wealth by the end of the 7th century. There was a massive redistribution of wealth. There was a shift in the economic center of gravity of the kingdom from the urban south to the rural north, where the monastic foundations were established.
The Merovingian family and other lords would found monasteries, which grew during the 7th century, becoming engines which made Merovingian Gaul wealthier and more stable than other regions in northwestern Europe. Much of Frankish Gaul remained scattered settlements, but far more populous, at least by 750, than it had been in the time of Clovis.
Now, there was new agricultural techniques in monasteries. The heavy-wheeled plow, which was capable of cutting and turning grasslands, sod and clay soils, very different from the Mediterranean. More efficient devices for harnessing animals in these plows.
Here's an abbey church island of on the island of Ionia. Here's an abbey church on the island of Ionia. Here's the abbey church on the island of Ionia. Here, the abbey church on the island of Ionia. This tiny island off Scotland's west coast is the site of many Iron Age forts and has been home to a monastic community since the 6th century. Missionaries from Iona were instrumental in converting the Celtic tribes of northern Britain to Christianity, though most of the Celts had long since been eradicated by the Romans.
The arm of monastic system would prove long indeed. The Irish missionary Columbanus 540 to 615, founded Merovingian dynasties at Luxeuil and Fontaine. The more important monasteries established on Iona and Lindisfarne, with close ties forged between monks and local tribal leaders to the political and economic gain of all. The lord who had the support of a monastery was worthy of loyalty. The lord, in return, gave privileges to monasteries, freedom from control of local bishops and jurisdiction over their own lands. Monasteries became politically powerful and were lordships in their own right.
The 7th century witnessed a rapid increase in monastic foundations in northwestern Europe. Monasteries had existed in Gaul, Italy, and Hispania since the 4th century. In the 5th century, a monastic movement began in Ireland and spread to the Celtic regions of Britain and to the continent. Most monastic foundations of the 7th century were located at trading crossroads and would play a critical role in trade and governance.
Monasticism became a road to political power for women. In monasteries, women had control over their own minds and bodies. They could wield influence, promoting their family's dynastic interests without pregnancy. They were guaranteed salvation, as salvation outside the cloister seemed uncertain. There were prayers of holy women regarded as particularly effective in securing divine support, further enriched convents through donations of land and wealth.
Sometimes new monastic foundations were double monasteries for men and women. Other times only for women, but usually ruled by abbesses from noble or royal families, at least in the case of women only. If not, they'd be ruled by abbots. In a world with very few political opportunities for women, being an abbess would provide a noble or a competent woman control over a monastery and much, much more. Some abbesses would even intervene as critical ambassadors and negotiators. Just wait until we get to Heloise. But monasteries for women would serve the interests of men as well. Namely, they were repositories of prayer regarded as essential to furthering the ambitions of their male benefactors. They provided a dignified place for retirement for politically powerful women, such as female relatives or rivals in the court. They also limited the number of powerful women who would be reproducing, because remember, if you're a nun, you're not allowed. They would also reduce the number of male claimants to power, which, in the case of the Franks, reduced the number of civil wars you're going to have to fight, or at least the number of people involved.
Monasticism played an important part in missionary activity. The Irish monks spread Christianity in northern parts of Britain and northern Europe. These were sponsored by the papacy and Merovingian royal family, especially its women.
Gregory I, 590 to 604, sent 40 Benedictine monks to Kent in 597. The efforts would be assisted by their local king Ethelbert, who married a Christian Frankish princess. How adorable. This pattern, though, would be repeated throughout southern and eastern Britain. Bede would claim that the tribes of England would be united in their shared allegiance to the Roman Church and its English archbishop at Ethelbert's capital at Canterbury. Bede would also credit the Roman Pope for initiating this achievement and the monastic rule for bringing it into fruition. Now, as long as we are on the topic of women and monasteries and their role in conversions in British kingship, we should also state that the Pope at this point was also doing things like sending gifts, writing letters, encouraging these princesses, particularly those who were Christian, to convert their husbands. Even sending mail, which is as politely worded as a pope can get, to quite simply say, "Why haven't you converted your husband yet? When you look in this lovely hand mirror that I have sent you, remember that the grace of God has sent you here to convert your husband to Christianity. Why haven't you converted your husband to Christianity? Convert your husband to Christianity!" At least, something of that state.
Envisioning a new role for the papacy, Byzantine power in Italy declined, and Gregory sought to create an autonomous Latin church. He was an influential theologian, intellectual successor of the Latin fathers became because he spread their teachings outside the Mediterranean. There was an emphasis on penance for the forgiveness of sins and the concept of purgatory as a place where the soul could be purified before admission into heaven. There was an emphasis on the pastoral care, proper instruction, and encouragement of the laity. They sought to increase the effective power of Christian worship by promoting the performance of music, the Gregorian chant.
And as Pope, in addition to sending letters and gifts, Gregory felt that his part was the part of creating the Christian Holy Commonwealth, under which, ideally, the emperor would defer to the church, though of course he generally did not, and be recognized as a power ordained by God. And Gregory did protest while executing the obnoxious laws, i.e., Emperor Maurice's prohibition of monastic life for state employees, and at least to quote the Pope himself, I have thus done my duty on both sides. I have obeyed the Emperor and yet have not restrained what ought to be said on God's behalf. End quote. Thank you, Britannica. But I digress. As a statesman, he would ensure the survival of the papacy against Lombard invaders, mostly throughout diplomacy and the management of papal states and revenue. He would maintain good relations with the Byzantines while still asserting his authority, as I mentioned. He supported monastic communities living under the rule of Saint Benedict. We'll get to him. But he would insist that the Jews' role in the crucifixion and denial of Christ's divinity would deprive them of rights in the Christian world and basically viewed them as second-class citizens.
Here we have on the left the Lindisfarne Gospels. This page from one of the astonishing illuminated, light-filled books produced by the monastery at Lindisfarne shows the opening of the Gospel of John. Why would monastic scribes have devoted so much time, energy, and skill to the decoration of this text? How do these artistic motifs compare with those featured on the metalwork found at Sutton Hoo?
Here we have on the right the cover of the Lindau Gospels. This book, bound in gilded silver and encrusted with jewels and ivory cameos, was presented by Pope Gregory the Great to a Lombard queen around the year 600. Remember the use of sending gifts? Yeah. Given what you have learned about the economic and cultural circumstances of Northern Europe, what is the significance of this rich gift? What would Gregory have been attempting to achieve by giving it? Answer in the comments below.
At the end of the 7th century, tensions among noble families in the Merovingian heartland of Neustria and in the Frankish border regions of Austrasia increased. The Austrasian nobles had profited from their steady push out of the Rhine, acquiring wealth and military power. The Merovingians had no such conquests and gave much land to monasteries, which decreased their wealth and capacity to attract followers.
After his death, his son Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, 688 to 741, would control both the Merovingian homeland and the Frankish royal administration. And for 2 generations, Merovingian kings were the figureheads in a realm ruled by Charles and his sons. In 687, the Austrasian nobleman Pepin, 635, maybe 45 to 714, made himself the Frankish king's right-hand man, that is to say, the Major Domus, or Major Dodo, for those playing along, and exercised royal authority while maintaining he was only a royal servant. He did this for the next 25 years.
Now on to Charles the Hammer Martel. He was the second founder of the Frankish state. In 733 or 734, he repelled a Muslim army sent out by the Umayyads. Victory won him great prestige, and he advanced into the Muslim-held region of the Narbonne, allied with the Benedictine missionaries from England who were attempting to convert the Low Countries and central Germany to Christianity. He combined missionary work with Frankish expansion.
The leader of the English Benedictines, Boniface, that is to say 672 to 754, brought him into contact with the papacy. Charles died in 741, and his sons Carloman and Pepin would be elected a new king. But they would exercise their power, and in 750, Carloman would enter a monastery and Pippin would seize the throne. Pepin would turn to Rome, and the Pope needed a powerful leader to help with his struggle against Byzantium, or at least over icons, and with the struggle against the Lombard kings. And man, Pepin was his man. Let's have a look. So here's the empire of Charlemagne, at least as of 814. When Charlemagne died in 814, he had created an empire that embraced a very large portion of the lands formerly owned by the Western Roman Empire. What are the geographical limits of his power? How are these limits dictated by the historical forces we've been studying? Along what lines was Charlemagne's empire divided after his death?
Now on to another success story, Charlemagne. Boniface appointed Pepin king of the Franks in 751 using the Old Testament precedent of Saul. Franks benefited from his rule. His son Charlemagne came to power in 768. He united the Franks through military conquest, annexed Lombardy and modern Germany, portions of Central Europe, and Catalonia in Spain. He forced pagans in Saxony to convert to Christianity. Courts supervised local governance, justice, and raised army within their territories. Local officials who convened courts, established tolls, and administered royal lands and collected taxes with a new system of coinage.
The court would send messengers, known as the missi, on tours through the countryside to relay his instructions and report back on the conduct of local administrators. This was the most thorough system of governance known in Europe since the height of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne would extend his authority. He changed the liturgy of Frankish churches. He reformed the rules of worship in Frankish monasteries. He declared the tenets of Christian belief, and he prohibited pagan practices, imposing Christian observances, of course, on the conquered Saxons. And who, boy, would those conquered Saxons be a thorn in his backside in the years to come.
Charlemagne also dealt with the Pope as he did other bishops in his empire. He supervised and approved papal elections, which protected him from his many enemies. Charlemagne once viewed kingship as a sacred office created by God to protect the church and promote the salvation of Christian peoples.
Here's Charlemagne's image of authority, a silver penny struck between 804 and 814 at Mainz. As indicated by the letter M at the bottom, it represents Charlemagne in a highly stylized fashion. There's a Roman emperor with a military cloak and laurel wreath. The inscription reads, Carlos Imp, AUG or AVG. In other words, Charles, Emperor Augustus. And his portrait is closely modeled on both the Hellenistic and, of course, Roman coins. As a cultural and intellectual flowering would take place in the Charlemagne's court, Charlemagne would recruit intellectuals from all over Europe to further the case of scholarship. Latin standardization and literacy were central to Charlemagne's goals. He needed a civitas Dei, or civitas Dei, a city of God where church officials and educated bureaucrats could not only serve as the basis of towns, but also ensure an educational infrastructure. Monasteries would serve as the nuclei for towns and spearhead his new codification and correction of Latin texts, mostly correcting spelling and clerical errors for people who didn't really know Latin very well. The Anglo-Saxon monk Alcuin was the leader of Charlemagne's circle. Under his supervision, Carolingian scholars produced much original Latin poetry and theological as well as pastoral tracts. But their primary efforts were devoted, as you might have guessed, to collating, correcting, and recopying ancient Latin texts, including the Vulgate.
To detect and correct scribal errors, Alcuin and his associates gathered as many different versions of the biblical text as they could find and compared them, word by word. When they determined the correct version, they made a new, corrected copy and destroyed the other versions. They developed a new style of handwriting, with simplified letter forms and spaces inserted between words, later known as the Carolingian minuscule, and they added punctuation.
Here's a revised edition of the Bible in Carolingian minuscule. The correction and circulation of accurate Bible text was among the many projects of the Carolingian Renaissance. This particular image comes from the text prepared by one of Charlemagne's most influential advisors. Say it with me. Alcuin of York. Furthermore, though, the clear layout and beautifully formed script of this manuscript copy helped readers without detailed knowledge of Latin to make out the words. Even though you may not be able to read Latin, you may still recognize individual words and letters, as you see, that are similar to what you use on this page. But now let's transition on to Charlemagne and his coronation. On Christmas Day in the year of 800, Charlemagne was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III. The imperial title would add little to Charlemagne's position, and Einhard claims that it was engineered largely without his knowledge. But he did crown his son Louis the emperor himself. As for Charlemagne's followers, the assumption of the imperial title was a declaration of independence and superiority. Western Europeans would crown emperors up through and until the 19th century.
This success brought a new, successful Western Roman Empire. For its precedent, popes would later claim political superiority over what became the Holy Roman Emperor. This coronation angered Byzantium. The emperor in Constantinople claimed to be the political successor of Caesar Augustus. There was a clear slight to the reigning empress Irene, who reigned between 797 and 802. This deepened Byzantine suspicion of Charlemagne's cordial friendship with Harun. But all this positivity must end somewhere. The Carolingians weren't doomed to last. When Charles died in 814, his empire descended intact to his only surviving son, Louis the Pious. Under Louis, the number of counts tripled, and they wanted more loot and power. They turned against each other, and Louis, well, their centralized authority broke down. The majority of the empire's free inhabitants found themselves dominated by local lords. There was also a breakdown in the Abbasids' silver supply to Europe, which led to external raids.
Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, would succeed him as emperor, but would face the Arab conquest, which made sailing dangerous and would substantially reduce the supply of goods from the east. This also reduced the trade with goods in Europe as well. Here we have the division of the Carolingian Empire under the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Following the death of Louis the Pious, at least formalizing the division of the Carolingian Empire among his grandsons, the treaty divided the empire into three separate kingdoms: West Francia, France; East Francia, the Holy Roman Empire; Lotharingia, mostly parts of modern-day France, Belgium, and Germany. And this division would set the stage for the development of distinct political entities within Western Europe, and marked the beginning of the fragmentation that would characterize the region throughout the Middle Ages. Lothair would win the ensuing civil war, though, as I'm sure you can guess. But when Lothar's line died out in 856, the compromise would dissolve. The East and West Franks would fight over Lothar's former territories, and, of course, the imperial title that goes with them. The empire disintegrated and was eventually divided amongst his sons in 840. Here we have West Francia, led by, of course, Charles the Bald, East Francia, Louis the German, and Lotharingia, which is, of course, to Lothair. And along with Lothair, as I mentioned, goes the imperial title.
This disintegration would be compounded by the new group of invaders, the Northmen. At first, it was small-scale operations, but soon some Viking attacks involved organized armies of thousands. By the 10th century, Vikings controlled eastern England, Ireland, and the islands of Scotland, Normandy, and in the east created a proto-Russian state. They later colonized Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. They assimilated rapidly, and threat diminished after conversion to Christianity. They destroyed monasteries. They also created towns and brought large amounts of silver into the economy.
Scandinavian traders were already familiar with figures in the North Sea and the Baltic ports of Europe when Charlemagne would come to power, but when the power of the Abbasids declined, the Vikings would, of course, do what they do, turn to plunder, ransom, tribute collection, and slaving. While this caused economic disruption, the creation of several short-lived Scandinavian kingdoms, at least in the short term, and in the long term, the Scandinavians would bring an influx of foreign trade, cause urbanization, a resurgence of centralized movements, and they would rapidly assimilate and adopt local customs. Here we have patterns of Viking activity and settlement from 800 to 1100, my wheelhouse. The Vikings were, of course, instrumental in maintaining commercial contacts amongst Northern Europe as well as the Byzantines and the Islamic world up until the at least 8th century, when changing historical forces would turn them into raiders and colonists. Hence the term Viking. It is an occupation after all. And what area was the original homeland of the Vikings? What geographic region did the Vikings first conquer and why? The areas marked in green show the territories that were later targeted by the pillagers. Why would the Vikings have avoided settlement in these areas until, well, later?
In response to the Viking threat, a loosely unified kingdom emerged for the first time in England under Alfred the Great, who reigned between 871 and 899. Now, with Alfred and his heirs, they assembled an effective armed force. They instituted mechanisms of local government. They founded new towns and they codified English laws.
Until the 8th century, Anglo Saxon was the only European vernacular used for regular written communication. They would establish a court school and foster a distinctive Anglo Saxon literary culture. Anglo Saxon became to rival Latin as a language of administration, history, scholarship, and spirituality. Oral traditions of poetic composition and storytellings would also be preserved through Anglo Saxon writings. Here we have a dragon powered Viking longboat, or at least that's what I like to call it. This manuscript illumination from a book copied in Anglo Saxon England depicts one of the vessels terrifyingly known to the shore dwelling peoples of northwestern Europe. Concerted efforts to ward off Viking invasions would lead to the establishment of the first unified English kingdom.
Now, this decline would reach into the Islamic world as well. We have the decline of the Abbasids, which was part of the impoverishment of Mesopotamia due to ecological crises. We have a slave revolt. We have the decline of tax revenues. We have the inability to pay bureaucracy and mercenaries.
Behind the collapse lay two features: the growing power of regional rulers and the sharpening of religious divisions between the Sunni and the Shiite. And among the Shiites themselves, of course, there would be their own internal divisions. In 909, the Shiite Fatimid dynasty would seize North Africa, and in 969 it would take Egypt. Another Shiite group would attack Baghdad in 927, Mecca in 930, and then seize the Kaaba. The Abbasid Caliphate would continue through 1258, when the Mongols would dissolve it. But it was effectively replaced with two new Muslim states in Persia and Egypt. In Al-Andalus, disputes over succession within the Umayyad dynasty were matched by new external pressures from small Christian states in the north. In the early 11th century, the caliphate would dissolve and be replaced by a host of smaller, weaker kingdoms. But that brings us to the end of today's video and the end of Chapter 7. Please tune in next time for Chapter 8. Take it easy, guys.